Actually, just have to repeat
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the second installment of our Fair Housing Symposium at Dusk. We're very excited for today's event, which is going to focus on HUD's new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and what it means for local governments. To be clear, there is nothing new about the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. HUD grant local governments that receive HUD funds have had a duty to affirmatively further fair housing since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. What's new is how they're supposed to go about that. That being said, this is not uncontroversial, this new rule, as you will quickly learn by just going on the internet and looking at some of the sites that have developed to oppose the implementation of this rule. I think that we couldn't have two more thoughtful and informed people today to help us discuss this controversy, to dispel the myths, and to explain the new rule. So I am delighted that both of them could be here, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. First, Raphael Bostic. It's very fun for me to introduce Raphael, as he and I go way back. So far way back that you probably see him squirm a little bit because, but really, I really was just going to say, Raphael, that I have had the opportunity to enjoy your humor and your intelligence and your wisdom and your warmth for many years. And I think, I know that all of you are going to enjoy those wonderful characteristics that he has. Today, and I think you're also going to enjoy hearing from someone who really he was as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. He was instrumental in developing this new rule. He was at HUD in that role for the first three years of the Obama administration. He came there from USC, from the Price School of Public Policy at USC. He is now back at the Price School. And I have notes because I have to remember his title. Here he is let me see if I can do this, the Judith and John Bedrosian Chair of Governance and
the policy and oh no.
No, I got it wrong. He's a bit longer title than I have, so. Governance and the public.
It's bad when you don't know your own title.
And the public enterprise.
Yes, that's it.
Yes, big surgery.
I was going to say the public interest, but I think
Yes,
it's not.
public enterprise. So, before going to USC, Raphael was an economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and he has written extensively on housing policy and housing finance in particular. And we're really, really grateful that Raphael was able to make the trip east to spend a little bit of time with us. And secondly, Raphael's going to talk for about half an hour, and then Jeff Lavelle, we're delighted, is from Apt Associates, is going to respond. Jeff is currently let me see if I get your title right, the Director of Housing and Community Development Initiatives at Apt Associates. He is truly one of the most innovative, I think, and clear-thinking experts on housing policy. Certainly when I have a question about housing policy, either an existing housing policy or maybe an idea about a new policy, I call Jeff. So, and he is really a fount of knowledge, and I think he also is remarkable, I think, in his willingness to rethink tired policy debates and to consider fresh ideas, which I have to say I think is sort of sadly rare in the field of housing. He spent much of his career as director of something called the Center for think tank called the Center for Housing Policy in DC, and really which aims to translate the research ideas and findings into policy implications, which I think no one does better than Jeff. So I'm delighted that both of them could be here today, and I think you'll enjoy what they have to teach us.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. Ingrid, thank you for the very, very kind introduction. It could have been a lot worse, at least for me. So, so I'm really, really grateful for that. And I want to thank Dust for having me here and to really talk about something that I actually didn't know hardly anything about before I went to HUD, but then wound up spending a lot of time on this. So I'm going to say this talk is very personal for me. When I went to HUD, I didn't run the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. I ran the Office of Policy Development and Research. And so when we started working on the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, it wasn't under PD&R where I was. It was under the Office of Fair Housing. They tried to do it, and it failed. And it failed because other people in the building didn't like what they did. So the secretary took it from FHEO, and he gave it to the general counsel's office with some of his people as the lead. And they tried it, and it failed. And I sat in some of the most angry meetings I've ever been in my life over this rule and the proposal. And I'm going to get a bit more into this, but when I talk about this project, I call it the Civil War project because within HUD, this issue brought out passions and opposition that was like a civil war. Right? And it was inside the building. This was before we got outside. This was not Tea Party people. This wasn't any of the people who you might have expected to oppose the notion of an anti-segregation and providing access opportunity initiative. This was inside. And so the third time they gave it to me, and I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to tell a quick story. So there was the secretary was frustrated after it failed the second time, so he brought everyone in and he said, we're going to have a fair housing retreat. And we're going to talk about this. Now, I was on vacation. I was in Boise, Idaho, trying to get away from people. And I was driving to southern Utah to meet some friends. And so it was an 8-hour drive, and I called in for the 8 hours of the drive. So I was at the whole meeting. And at the end, the secretary asked, okay, so we want to write a mission statement on what we think we're trying to do here. And Sandy Henriquez, who was the Assistant Secretary of Public and Indian Housing, volunteered that she would help write it, and nobody else spoke up. And so, in one of the dumbest things I've ever done, I agreed to help Sandy out. And so we wrote a statement, everybody loved the statement, and then they said, okay, so one of you guys should run it the next run. And I was like, Sandy, you can't really do this, you have too many other things. So I wound up taking it. And that's how it started. It was 2.5 years later that we finally had a rule in place. This was very, very difficult. It was painstaking negotiations. Within the building, there was litigation, relitigation, re-litigation of issues until we got to something that nobody was completely satisfied with, but everyone could stomach. And so when I talk about AFFH, people often will say, why don't we just do this? And I was like, we are not in the world of why don't we just, right? This is the world of negotiation. Everyone had their ideas, and we had to get to a place where we could actually move forward. And just to give you a flavor of this, the way regulation happens, and there are people here who actually know this better than me, but a regulation is proposed, there's a lead unit in an agency, then it goes around and all the other units in the agency have to concur. If they don't concur, the reg can't leave the building, which is why all this negotiation is so critical. Then once it leaves the building, it goes to the Office of Management and Budget, right? And then they send it to all the agencies in the federal government, and they all have to concur, right? And so getting regulation through is incredibly difficult. and it takes a lot of time. And that's before it actually goes into public comment. Right? So if you get through an OMB and it gets out of the administration, then it goes to public comment. AFFH, I think in our proposed rule we had 1,200 comments, something like that, and you have to answer every single one. Right? So there has to be a record of response. And so the effort and the undertaking to do this is massive. And there are many people who can stop it. Right? And so that's just a backdrop for how regulation happens. So the idea that there's this rampant regulation and you can just do anything you want is just patently false. Right? And so this was one of those, and we actually did something pretty good, I think. So in many ways, for the rest of this talk, what I'm going to do is talk a bit about history, what is AFFH, where did it come from, what are the ways that AFFH can be done, and AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's a lot of words, I say AFFH. And then I'm going to talk about the new reg and really where it came from, how it evolved to get to what it is, and then I'll talk at the end a bit about why I'm optimistic and why this can really, I think, help change communities across the country. Now, this is kind of a different talk because I'm not showing you regression tables, I'm not doing all that kind of stuff. But in some ways, what we did through the building of the regulation built upon a lot of research and a lot of work that people like Jeff and Ingrid and others and Larry had done for us. And so it's a different kind of discussion, but it is very evidence-based and it does rely on a lot of what we know in terms of urban policy. All right, so I'm going to start with just some background on the affirmative furthering. So the Fair Housing Act has two mandates, gave HUD two mandates. The first was to eliminate discrimination. And HUD has a huge infrastructure to do that. There's a lot of enforcement folks in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. There are resources given to nonprofits and legal aid organizations, technical assistance to tenants, a whole host of infrastructure there to stop discrimination. And that is really about enforcement and about compliance. And it's important that I say those two words because the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate, which is the second mandate, is supposed to be something different. So when we think about the history of discrimination and segregation, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened, right? And we want to stop that. But then that bad stuff actually had impacts, right? And those impacts, if we're going to actually move forward, we need to do affirmative things. We need to actively use resources to try to redress those disparities and make some improvements. And so in addition to stopping discrimination, stopping the bad things, the Act called on HUD to encourage communities to affirmatively do things, go forward and use your resources to try to make that difference, right? And while there's been a lot of infrastructure on the enforcement and compliance, on the affirmative side, the infrastructure is far less robust, and I think you would say that it's just not very mature in terms of what resources and what the institutions have in place, right? And so I think about this as a carrot and a stick, right? The enforcement and compliance is the stick, the affirmative furthering is the carrot, and we've been very heavy on the stick side, and so communities have been largely reluctant to engage in these conversations because what they've seen from experience is that when you have this conversation, you get wrapped, right? You get hit. And so I felt, and the Secretary felt that it was very important that we lift up the carrot aspect to say there are good things that can happen in communities and people can be better off if we pursue these strategies, and we're going to help you do that. So that's the goal. All right, so the second thing I want to talk about is sort of how do you affirmatively further fair housing? All right, so we have the mandate to do it. How should you do it? And there are really two broad strategies that people speak to. So when the Fair Housing Act passed, there were broad disparities in wealth, in income, in employment, in owning assets, in a range of areas. So affirmatively friendly fair housing is like, what are the steps you should take to get people to close those disparities, to help us close those disparities based on race and protected classes. And so there are really two ways you can do it. One is to have people who live in isolated and abandoned neighborhoods get access to the places that have resources and amenities. And we can call that sort of a mobility strategy. You get people to move or have easy ways to get to those communities. And then the second is to rebuild the communities that have been abandoned and have been underinvested to make sure there's opportunity there. Right? And that you can think of that as a redevelopment strategy. Now, we in our policy space actually do both. Right? So think about the Moving to Opportunity demonstration. Think about the Housing Choice Voucher Program. These are all programs that are designed to help lower income people and minorities move to places and have an opportunity to move to places that their income or their wealth may not have allowed them to access otherwise. In terms of most of the block grant programs, like the Community Development Block Grant Program, Choice Neighborhoods, which is an urban public housing redevelopment program, in today, the promise zones that you hear the Obama administration talk about, these are all redevelopment programs. These are, let's take resources, let's build up the assets and amenities in communities, and to the extent possible, have opportunity be present in those places. Right? And they're both here. And the question is, and the reason why this became such a fight, is that the question would always come up, well, which should we do? And the answer is both. That's what most reasonable people would say. But that's not the answer that we usually got when we are having these discussions about the regulation. And the reason we didn't have that discussion, that it became an either or, is one word, and that word is money. Right? Because we live in an environment and in a society where resources are scarce, where we don't have enough money to do all the things that we might want to do, every dollar spent in one area is a dollar not spent in your area. Right? And so the effort then is to say, I'm going to prevent any dollars from not being spent in my area. Right? And then we get to hand-to-hand combat. Right? And so that was the backdrop for this entire discussion. There's a lot of passion on both sides, right? And I would say the mobility people, the advocates, they are passionate arguments in making the point clearly that evidence shows that when people live in concentrated poverty, in segregated neighborhoods, they have worse outcomes. And that they're much better off when they live in more integrated communities and communities that aren't so concentrated in terms of their poverty. And you can, you've all, I'm sure, heard of the work that's been recently discussed by Raj Chetty, where he talks about, people, young people, if they live in a non-segregated place, they earn thousands of dollars more than if they would live in a more concentrated, an area of more concentrated poverty. In our building at HUD, when I was there, Ron Sims, who was the deputy secretary, used to always say, a zip code is the best predictor of a person's life prospects. Right? It's really place ties you, and in some ways it can determine you. And so mobility people say, let's get them out of those places. Let's get to place, let's make place more neutral. And in the redevelopment area, the question is, well, why should there be any places of blight and abandonment? And an argument that we had, which was actually quite interesting in one of our Civil War meetings, someone, I think it was Sandy, said, when you take a mobility strategy, you are basically saying the people who are bearing the brunt and the cost before now have to bear the brunt moving forward. Because moving is traumatic, moving is hard, moving can be isolating, and you can lose a lot of your social network and your social fabric by doing those things. And on some level that shouldn't be, that's not fair. Right? So the argument is flying across the table, we can't do this, we should do that. And what we tried to do through the reg was really say, okay, we're not going to pick on this. We're going to let communities have a conversation and decide for their context what the right approach is, and we're going to help them do it. And it took a long time for us to get everyone on board that, I may have a view, but I'm not living in all these communities. And I could come in and tell them what to do, but that's really not going to work. Federal government coming telling local people what to do tends not to go very well, right? And so we need to change our orientation and get to a different outcome. Now, in terms of AFFH, so when we came in, there already was an AFFH process that existed. There was a consolidated plan that all communities need to do, and as part of that consolidated plan, there was a requirement that communities write a report called an analysis of impediments, or the AI. All right, and the AI was supposed to lay out all the impediments to fair housing and access to opportunity, and presumably there would be strategies to move forward. It was a good idea. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And it didn't work for a number of reasons. First, the communities didn't write them. Right? They paid consultants, the consultants wrote them. The communities, I don't think, read them to know what was really in it. And then HUD didn't read them, it turned out either. Right? And so it became kind of a problem, because once everyone else HUD's not reading them, they stopped doing them. So the GAO did an analysis of the AIs and found that 40% of the AIs had been done, were older than, I think, 8 years old, and you're supposed to do these every 5. Right? So half of them hadn't been done in their regular timing. And so there was a general condemnation of the entire process and a feeling that this needed to change, that reform was needed, because without having progress in the diagnosis and the strategy, you're not going to see change on the ground. That's not going to work. Okay, so then we came in, AFFH is on the table. I've already told you about our failures and going through all that. So we have a reg, and the reg has a number of key elements. Perhaps the most important of those elements is something that we call the Assessment of Fair Housing, or the AFH. And the Assessment of Fair Housing was designed to replace the AI, and it had 6 elements. The first was, it was going to ask communities to identify whether there are any fair housing issues. Are there any lawsuits? Are there any consent decrees that you're dealing with? And all that kind of stuff. The second was to ask communities to identify in their jurisdictions areas where there's segregation, populations that are segregated, and in particular highlight racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, because we know those are particularly bad. And they were going to do it using a new tool that HUD provides. So HUD was going to actually provide a data tool that's online. And that exists. You can actually, if you Google AFFH tool, you can go and you can pick a community and do any kind of mapping that you want. It's actually pretty neat. Third is you have to review the data, see where there's segregation, see where the racial concentrated areas of poverty, and try to talk about, well, what caused these to exist and why do they persist. Let's try to get to a notion of what are the structural barriers that prevent communities from having an opportunity to advance. The fourth is that once you identify those barriers and the problems, make some goals, establish some priorities, and come up with some strategies to move forward. And then the fifth one is, and this is for the first round, you won't have to do this, but tell us how you did in getting to those goals that you laid out in the prior report. Right? So we really want you to be backward-looking and results-oriented. Right? Did things actually change? And then the last point in the AFH is to really detail the process of community engagement and outreach. What did you do to make sure that everyone had a voice and that people had an opportunity to weigh in and participate in the diagnosis and in the planning moving forward? So those were the 6 elements of the assessment of fair housing. Yeah, there's a lot to say on that, but I'll just keep moving. There are a couple other elements that I wanted to emphasize. The first is that the explicit refocusing on opportunity and trying to provide access to opportunity was something that was new, right? And that, I think, it harkened back to the original realities of the Fair Housing Act, where at the time the Act passed, there were tremendous disparities in opportunity, and it was one of the things that drove the Civil Rights Movement. And so calling out this, reminding us that this is really about opportunity was quite important. A second is that we broadened the coverage. So in addition to having jurisdictions to get block grants, we had housing authorities that are now involved in the process. And we tried to get some of the property owners who were involved in some of the rental assistance programs. We're still working on that. But it is more broad. And the third aspect is that it's more collaborative. So the process encourages collaboration between entities that have responsibilities in a local jurisdiction. So to have a housing authority and the city do a joint report, and also regionally, to encourage the submission of a single regional assessment of fair housing that all the cities would sign on to, because opportunity in many regards doesn't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. It is sort of a much more organic and regional thing. So having everyone participate is potentially interesting. All right, so that's the new regulation. It's been out for about a year now. I think it's about a year, and jurisdictions are now kind of working through it to the first round to get their reports in. For me, I think the new AFFH rule has something for everyone. There's something for federal governments and local governments. There's something for advocates, and there's something for communities. And when I say something, I mean I really mean there are challenges that are posed for each of them, and tremendous opportunities. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I'll focus most on communities, because that's what I was asked to do, but I'll sprinkle in some other things as well. All right, so in terms of communities, I want to make a general statement, and that is, if this works, if it works the way that I think about it should, and I actually think it will work for many jurisdictions, we're going to see qualitatively different conversations that take place on the ground around issues of race, gender, and access to opportunity. And to me, the different conversation is really perhaps the most important thing that we can have. In some places, we don't have any conversations about this. And if you think about the presidential campaign, there's race all over that campaign, but no one is really talking about it in a way that's helpful or constructive. And we don't have venues, we don't have very many vehicles to have constructive conversations. We were actually trying to point to something positive. And AFFH has that frame, and I think that is tremendously important. I think it could potentially help people learn how to have these conversations and hopefully move us forward. All right, so with that general statement, there are some specific things I wanted to say. First, I think the data tool is incredibly important. And the fact that the data tool is public is incredibly important, because it now allows everyone to have the same information set. Right? So what often happens at local community levels is that some people come with a lot more information than others. And so they can talk past people who they don't want to have be part of that conversation. The data tool allows everyone in their home to be fully informed and fully prepared to have a conversation. So when they show up and someone says something that isn't exactly right, you can say, oh no, I know that's not right. Right? And that stopping to correct things that are wrong is something that doesn't happen nearly often enough in communities when plans are made and when investment decisions are made as well. So I think that that is particularly important. That's actually also a benefit from the advocacy perspective as well. I was talking earlier about the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So we call that HMDA. It's a banking regulation that requires banks to provide information on every mortgage application they get and what happened to that application. And it's made public. And they never used to do that until before '78, I think it was. So before 1978, banks would say, oh no, there's no problem, we're doing everything wonderful. We treat everyone exactly the same, no disparities, whatever. And there was no data actually to refute that. Now, as soon as the HMDA data came out, we see disparities everywhere, right? And now, and it triggered a different conversation. The banks could no longer ignore or act as if these issues weren't real. And I think that the HUD data tool will arm advocates in the same way to be able to construct stories that are impossible to ignore and refute. And most of the HUD data is actually, the data in the tool is public. But to generate maps that have overlays and all that kind of stuff requires a level of sophistication and resources that many institutions, organizations, and certainly families don't have. Right? So even though a lot of this data was public, it wasn't really accessible and usable, and the data tool changes that in an important way. A second thing I think is really important about the new regulation is that it's results oriented. We actually are trying to reduce these disparities, and the question that should be asked 5 years from now is, did the disparities narrow? Not where did you spend the money? Right. So at the end of the day, you can spend the money 100 different ways that could reduce the disparities. Right. So I don't think we should be anchored on that question. We should be anchored on, however you spent the money actually create change? And if it did, that's great. We want to do more of it. And if it didn't, let's step back and ask a question about, well, what should we do differently? How can we do things differently? And I think that is tremendously important. And I'll tell you, this was an area that the folks at HUD were not happy about. Many were not happy about it because there's tremendous flexibility. There are many things that HUD likes to be clear, rule-based, bright lines. Either you're on this side and you're on that side. If we now set up a reg where 60 different strategies could be the right answer. Right? How do you get compliance in that space? And there was a lot of discomfort there. I'm also hopeful that the new reg will generate a lot more interactive engagement. Because we have some technology, the federal government doesn't always do a lot of technology, because we are walking people through a process, we've got a lot of technical assistance to help. I think that we're setting up a system and a structure that can actually help in many different ways. And then the fourth thing I would say is, I think we're going to see some real innovative strategies. Right? So at the very end of my tenure at HUD, when I was thinking about in a world when we have AFFH, the question I asked is, okay, suppose someone says, okay, I want to do a strategy. What do we tell them they should do? Right? If they say, I want to do mobility, right? How should I do it? What's the best way to do it? Or I want to do equitable economic development in this district. And what we see today is not enough evidence on a menu of strategies that we know work. Right? So we have some ideas, we have some thoughts, we have a couple of pilots. But I think there's going to be much more work, there is much more work that needs to be done on this, and we're all working on these questions to some extent. But I think what we're going to also have is an opportunity to really tap into the creativity of hundreds of communities across the country who are going to try things. They're going to say, well, I know my community, and I think these things can work, and that's important. All right, so two other things I want to say, and then I think I'm just about out of time. All right, so the first is the question of how will jurisdictions respond? So I reread what I was asked to talk about today, and that was one of the questions, and I didn't have this in, so I'm going to just add this in. So I think we're going to have 3 types of jurisdictional responses. The first response is the first type is, we're not going to do this, I hate this, we're not going to talk about this at all, right? We call them the bad actors, right? There are a number of them out there, we know they exist, and no matter what you did, that's what they were going to do, all right? Then there are going to be a bunch of folks who are, I'm gung-ho, I love this, finally someone's giving me information and a vehicle to make a difference, right? I call those the willing, right? You go off with the willing, we can do great things, and they will be creative. And then we have the great middle, right? And that great middle, as part of this process, I flew around the country and did a lot of listening sessions, talked to a lot of local government officials, trying to test fly the regulation. And we didn't find a lot of bad actors. We didn't find a lot of gung-hos either. What we found, though, are people who were kind of willing to do it, but they wanted help. Right? They wanted to have some hand-holding, and they wanted to know that HUD was not setting a trap. Right? Because they all have had HUD as the enforcer, as the compliance, and so all their experiences are, okay, when we start a process, if anything goes wrong, we're going to be the fall. We're going to take the fall for it. And so much of my time was spent convincing them that, we have an enforcement arm. I'm not that arm, right? And we're going to set up a process that is going to be a partnership. And so, one of the big challenges here is to make that big middle believe in the process and take it seriously. And that's the last thing I want to say, which is this puts a tremendous burden on the federal government, on HUD. Right? How HUD actually pursues this will go a long way toward determining whether this works or not. This notion of enforcement versus encouragement is a real issue. And the HUD staff that are there, the folks who are going to probably take the lead on this, they have 25 years of learned behavior of enforcement, right? It's almost reflexive, right? And so they've got to learn a different way of engaging with communities. We have people in another part of the office, 25 years, who have gone out of their way to say we're not going to take that enforcement, right? And so if there were a problem, right, it's hard to get those problems lifted up and taken seriously as well. So the department itself has to change how it approaches. A second thing that is very important, though, is HUD actually has to read these things. Right, HUD has to assess them, engage with them, and understand them so that it gets taken seriously. Right? The AI process broke down because everybody knew you sent the thing in, and they just sat in the email. I don't even think they downloaded the things. Right? They just kept it there. They saw that it was from City X, and then you can check off the box. That is it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of staff effort to really do this seriously, and I think that is another significant onus. And it really raises the question of does the department have the right mix of talent and the level of talent needed to accomplish this. Right. All that said, with my caveats, I actually am pretty pleased because I think that the way this regulation is structured, there are going to be communities that do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. There'll be conversations that they're going to have that they wouldn't have had otherwise. It won't be perfect, and everyone will not do it the way we want them to do it. But Sean, our secretary, always said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right? So we shouldn't need 100% compliance participation to feel like we've moved in a very positive direction. And so I think that's where we're headed. So thank you.
I'll let folks move on to their next class. Raphael is, you're always a hard act to follow. You know, he was literally in the room where it happened, you know. To quote the latest, I only know this because my daughter listens to the soundtrack all the time, like every day, 5 times. And I wasn't, right? I've been at HUD, and I know how the regulatory process works or doesn't work a little bit, but on this one I've been more an observer. But I do work for APT. I should say really quickly that APT Associates, we are, among other things, we provide contractual services to HUD, and we are have a relationship as a technical assistance provider with regard to AFFH. So I should make 100% clear that I am here talking in my personal capacity, and I'm not talking on behalf of APT, I'm not talking on behalf of HUD. And just in case, it would be great to find out how many people here are from HUD. Anybody? All right, look at that. So I will have people making sure that I don't say the right thing. Just so while we continue, how many students? Raise your hand if you're a student. And how many people from local government? Okay, few. And housing authorities? All right. And nonprofits? Okay. And did I miss anybody? You're not a nonprofit? Okay, advocates. Advocates, how many advocates? All right. So it's a great mix of people, and it actually reminds me, I think, and really reinforces the importance of this being something that many, many different people participate in. I think at the end of the day, if this is only an exercise that local government does and none of you are involved, I don't think this is going to be as successful as it could be if there was greater participation. So I think it's really important that you all are aware of this process. So I've been asked to address 3 questions. One is, what am I hearing about the rule? The second is, will it be effective? And the third is, will it encourage regional thinking? So I'm going to try to tackle those. Raphael already spoke a little bit about some of those. And remarkably, we had the same 3 buckets, actually, so I'll come back to that a little bit. So what are we hearing? So one thing, we're certainly hearing concerns and apprehension from some of the local government officials that are responsible for putting these together. Anytime there's a new process, there's going to be some fear. There's, you know, oh my God, how can I do this? It's so much work. I'm really busy. How can I get this done? And that makes a lot of sense. It is, people are busy. There are a lot of mandates. Some agencies are very, very small. I will say, though, that I do think the concerns about administrative burden are overblown, in the sense that I really think that this is something that is doable. It is a feasible exercise. In contrast to the analysis of impediments, HUD has given a template where there are questions that it wants people to follow and to answer. HUD's also provided a data tool that provides very specific charts and maps that, for the most part, you can complete the exercise using these provided tools. That doesn't mean that there's no learning curve. It doesn't mean it's easy. It does mean that it's easier, I think, to do this manageably within an agency. And I will say the experience that we've had, HUD is going around sponsoring training sessions, technical assistance trainings. We've done a number of sessions, and inevitably what happens is people come in, they're really scared, they're really worried. By the end, they feel a lot more confidence that they can handle this, that it's not so scary, that they've kind of walked it through. And so I would encourage people who are responsible for implementing this to try to attend one of those sessions, and they're going to be kind of doing a roadshow all over the country. And there are webinars and things. And so really the goal is to help people make this doable, not to create something that is so hard and so impossible that you have to just throw up your hands. So that's number one. There's also some skepticism, I think. We're hearing skepticism. Is this going to be any different? Is HUD going to read it? Right? Even if they do, is it really going to lead to change? People who've been working for a long, long time. And I think that's understandable that people would be concerned. And I think it's incumbent upon HUD to show that this is a different process. But I also think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to make this a different process. This is not, I think we need to be very, very clear. This doesn't work if all this is jurisdictions prepare plans, HUD reviews it, nobody else has any participation, and you rely entirely on HUD as an enforcer to sort of tell people whether their plans are acceptable or not and to make sure they get implemented, okay? It just doesn't work. HUD is going to be evaluating the plans, they are going to be providing feedback, but they have a very limited period of time in which to accept or deny the plans. Their ability to actually reject plans in the end of the day, they can't reject every plan that they get, it's just not going to be politically possible, right? So a lot of this depends on local jurisdictions taking advantage of this process to really make it work and to actually make it meaningful. And a lot of it, I think there's a role for advocates and for nonprofits and others to be involved in the process and to use this as a way to constructively engage their local communities to really develop more effective strategies. So it will work, but only if we're all kind of engaged in this. There's also been, you've probably read this on the internet or in various newspapers, there's a lot of fear out there. We hear a lot about how the federal government's trying to take over local zoning, right? And there are communities out west in particular and the southwest that they want to give back their money, they don't want to do this, they're just, there's all this fear. And some of it is this engine that we've seen in other cases where it's not really based on any facts, it's just somebody declares it to be so, and then it gets repeated on this media and that media, and all of a sudden, soon, you're getting calls from Congress saying, why does HUD want to tell local communities what their zoning code should be? And I think at the end of the day, that's really not what the process is designed to do. The process is a planning process designed to help communities sort of work through data about what's going on in their communities to help make better decisions about how to affirmatively further fair housing. It's not really about the federal government all of a sudden writing local zoning codes. At least that's not going to happen, I think, through the preparation of these documents in HUD's review process, right? So there's a lot of, I would say, fear on all sides about whether it's going to be effective and whether it's going to be different and is it going to be too much. And the reality is just somewhere in between, is that I think this is going to be a feasible process. It's going to be meaningful if we make it meaningful, and it's not going to be, I don't think, a lot of micromanagement. I do think one thing I would just say here is I think the intersection between these plans and the legal process bears some examination. One of the concerns that some local communities have is, are people going to sue me over this, right? If I do a bad job, am I going to get sued? If I do too good a job and then I don't follow up with it, am I going to get sued, right? And I think those are legitimate fears, right? And I think that there needs to be folks need to work that out. HUD needs to provide guidance about how to address that fear, and I think ultimately, we have to kind of wait and see how things happen. But I think the goal of this process is actually to keep people from being sued, right? It's to encourage people to develop plans that are meaningful and actually achieve the letter and the spirit of the Fair Housing Act, so that they're no longer in a position where they're out of compliance, right? And therefore, hopefully there'll be fewer lawsuits. But I'm not, I don't practice law, so I can't anymore, so I can't really say that. I will say, by the way, I used to practice law, and I have worked on fair housing, and I was just reflecting the other day that Tim Kaine and I both started out doing fair housing work. Somewhere after that, our careers diverged. And here I am. Will it be effective? Will it be effective? So I, like Raphael, I have my 3 categories. I had them in a slightly different order. And I would use a little bit different categories, but I have slightly different sort of things to say about them, but we have the same three. So the first is, there are going to be people who are going to use this process as a platform to get things done. Right? You call that the willing. I call these people who really care. We're hearing there are some people who work in local government who for a long time have wanted to do things but haven't had really the leverage to move them through. They might want to see an inclusionary zoning ordinance, they might want to see more mobility. This gives them a platform and a vehicle for putting ideas on the table. They can put them in their plans, they have a route for surfacing things and giving them more attention. So I think that's important. And I think there are other people out there who may or may not already have the motivation to do it, but will take the process seriously and will look at the data and actually be convinced by the data and see things they didn't know about before, right? So you do the analysis, you realize, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that all our voucher holders are living here and all the schools with good schools are over there, and there's a disconnect, right? And the maps and the questions are designed to help people see that, right? And that will lead people, even if they didn't start out with a motivation, some people will get motivation. So I think that's very important, and I think that's great. I also think there are a group of people and jurisdictions that just don't want to do anything. So call them what you want, but they're going to be recalcitrant. They're not going to move forward. It's going to be a challenge to get them to use this process. They're certainly not going to voluntarily move and say, oh my God, all of a sudden I've seen the light, I'm going to change my mind, right? And so there has to be some process involving HUD enforcement, perhaps involving advocates or something. And it's going to be a challenge. And to be honest, I think it's an open question about whether this process in and of itself is enough to move those kinds of folks forward. But that remains to be seen. There is this big gap in the middle, right? And I think of these as open-minded communities. That's how I call them. People who are open-minded and might be willing to do things, but really don't know how to do. Have you ever been to a Passover Seder? You know how there's like 4 kinds of children, right? Yeah. This is what I'm thinking about. There's 4 kinds of children, right? You've got the ones who don't know what the questions to ask, and the wise ones, the Rasha. So we need a 4th one, actually. It just occurred to me. Yeah, I don't know. We're gonna. But you have these folks. They don't really know what to do, right? And so, and here is I have some fears. I think on the one hand, I think these people will go through. They'll take the process seriously, and they will prepare plans, and hopefully it'll do some good. The question is, will it do as much good as it could, given where they're starting from and their interests? And I'm not sure. And the reason is that HUD has, I think, deliberately created a process that is doable and set a series of minimum standards. And so they've set the standard here because they want everyone to be able to do it without being so crazy that they throw up their hands. They haven't necessarily, but they acknowledge that's the minimum. There's more that you can do, right, to do an excellent plan. And I think what we really need to do is, how do we help open-minded jurisdictions actually do an excellent assessment of fair housing rather than just an adequate assessment of fair housing, right? And this, I think, is going to where all of you come in, right? This is where advocates and foundations and nonprofits and potentially regional intermediaries and kind of work on how do we help people make the most of this process. So instead of just meeting the minimum standards, we're using local data to actually make it more contextual. We're thinking about very specifically what are the kinds of things we can do to use vouchers more constructively. We're thinking about a whole series of things that really might go above and beyond the minimum. And that's going to take some work. And you can say that's HUD's job, you can say it's other people's job. I think it's all of our jobs. I will say that HUD does not have a long history of seeing its role primarily as an educator and as somebody designed to help people achieve excellence through best practices. A lot of HUD work is focused on enforcement and on technical assistance designed to help people meet minimum standards, not necessarily designed to help people achieve excellence, right? And so the question is, either HUD has to evolve to actually focus on promoting excellence, or you all need to do it, or it needs to be some combination. I would like to see that happen, but that's just me personally. But I will say this, that I would say I'm seeing a lot of HUD is putting a lot of resources right now into helping people understand what this rule is about and how to do it. And that is a real step in the right direction. And it's we helped put it together. I would say it's a very good training program. I would encourage people to do it. I'm biased, obviously, but anyway, so it's a good step in the right direction, but we're going to need to see more of that. So the other thing is that it's important to understand that the assessment of fair housing is only the first step. That's the document that you prepare, right? The idea is you prepare an assessment of fair housing. It's designed to diagnose what your fair housing issues are. You're supposed to identify a series of goals and map out a broad strategy. But it's not where you actually adopt the changes that lead to the improvements in fair housing, right? That's what happens subsequently. And so you're supposed to, as part of your consolidated plan, which is essentially your application for HUD block grant assistance, and in your housing authority plan, your PHA plan, which is essentially where you describe how you're going to use your housing authority resources, you're required now to basically address the obstacles and the goals that you address in your plan and actually, So the question is that going to happen, right? Is that follow-up going to happen? And what is what is HUD's role going to be, at the field office level and trying to make sure that happens, but also what is our role in helping people do that? And then the other related question is, are we going to go beyond HUD programs and actually think about the other things that we can do as localities in particular, such as inclusionary zoning, right? And that is something that it doesn't find its way into the consolidated plan, right? And so, and there is some reference in the rule if you look to other kinds of plans, right? So whether that's comprehensive plans or regional transportation plans or public health plans, but the rule structure is still kind of built on the foundations of the HUD process, right? Of the consolidated plan, the PHA plan. And to make this work, we're going to have to connect this beyond the HUD plans to also think about the non-HUD vehicles. And that's where I think it's going to be challenging, but really important if we want to have an impact. Because there's only so much you can do with HUD resources. You have to think about low-income housing tax credits. You have to think about your tax policy, your zoning policy, your planning policy, your permitting policy, and all of those things. It's the same jurisdiction, so you still have the legal responsibility to do these things. But it's not clear to me that the process is mapped out as clearly for making those connections. So finally, I'm probably over my time. I'm just going to wrap up by saying one word about regional thinking. Does it encourage regional thinking? So HUD very clearly encourages regional collaboration in preparing the assessment of fair housing. There is they are pushing local housing authorities to partner with their cities. They're encouraging communities to plan together. I think it's a big open question about whether that, and to what extent that actually happens. Regional collaboration has been a goal for a long, long time. It has remained a goal. There are only a handful of places where there's a lot of regional collaboration. So I think it's going to remain to be worked out. We are seeing some places that have requested help to pull regional plans together. I think that's encouraging. I think if we can develop some models about how this works, that will be promising. But regionalism is not easy. It's great when you're in academia to look at it and say, what a great idea! Why don't these people work together, But the other thing to just remember about regionalism is that regionalism is not just 4 or 5 jurisdictions banding together to work together. It's also about each jurisdiction within a region thinking about its role within the region, right? So the current process really works best for large urban jurisdictions, right? If you're a rural community or if you're a smaller suburban jurisdiction, it doesn't work quite as well, right? Because if you look at your community, you're a small exclusive white jurisdiction. Do you have a lot of segregation? Doesn't look that way, right? Right? And right? There's the disparities are very little, right? But are you meeting your fair share of affordable housing needs? No, right? Do you have the So the question is, what's your role within that regional context? And I think that needs more clarification. And it doesn't require regional collaboration. It just requires regional thinking, right? And so hopefully that will happen, but it's going to take some work. So I'll stop there.
We're going to open it up for questions, but I just want to quickly take the moderator's prerogative and ask you to sort of answer, because that's exactly actually what I wanted to ask you, both of you. And just sort of playing devil's advocate is that it does seem to me that that's kind of, and I'm not sure exactly how HUD could have dealt with that, but the question is, it seems like to me the incentives for regional collaboration and the encouragement is pretty weak. And I mean, what more could we do to solve the problem that the very jurisdictions that we might care the most about trying to get to, right, are these, all-white suburbs who really don't care about participating. Frankly, they may just opt out entirely because they don't really care about the CDBG funds, right, or getting any HUD funding. So
how can we encourage that regional collaboration more meaningfully?
So I think, so first of all, thank you for the comments. I thought they were helpful and all really on point. We're at the very beginning, and this is hard. I guess from a regional perspective, a couple things to think about. The first is that most regions don't function well today. They don't function as regions. We have a bunch of places in the same place. And a planning process is not going to be the trigger that gets everyone to all of a sudden start having these conversations. What we wanted to do at a very early stage was to identify our concept of what a good regional approach might look like. And just put it out there as a marker. I don't think this actually takes that a lot of folks are actually going to do it. But you know, one of the things that...
Why not, like, you know, agree to, you know, provide more technical assistance for jurisdictions that are
Yeah, I mean, the
are
problem,
submitting a regional...
Yeah, so the problem is, you know, ask jurisdictions what they think about that technical assistance, right? And you know,
It's great. We aren't providing TA.
it is now,
Right.
it is now, but when you're doing the reg, right, they don't know what we're gonna do, right? So you know, I could promise them a lot of things, and they'd be like, yeah, whatever, right? And so I think that you know, the one thing that you could do, which we weren't gonna do, is say if you do a regional, you get to skip around.
Yeah,
Right, so
exactly.
you don't have to do this every 5 years, you can
Right,
do it once every
exactly.
10, right? But for now, I think as a first time,
Yeah.
that would have blown up the process in the building, right? Because I think that there were factions in the building who believe everyone is a no-go, right? And that if you're gonna start to give someone a 10-year waiver, right, you're saying, okay, you can act nice for 1 year, and then you got 9
By
years
the way,
to do
that's
absolute.
actually- That's another way that HUD could sort of be serious about this process. It's kind of like the ACSP, the PAB accreditation, right? That you can pass, but you can pass with like a 3-year, you know, renewal, or a 5-year, or a 10-year. If you do a fabulous job, then say, hey, you don't have to do this again for 10 years, rather than saying we're going to sue you. It's more of a carrot.
Okay, so that's nice. But we're coming off of an AI process where I couldn't get people in the building to read it, right? Now you're telling me I'm going to have the people read it, and then
Okay, let me try one more.
draw gradations about quality. Go ahead.
What about on the regional side? What if you had at least asked jurisdictions to, had part of the data tool be a comparison between their racial composition, their demographics, and the demographics of the region as a whole?
It is.
So it is.
That is in there?
So it's not in the it's in tabular form, but that stuff is available. We definitely
So
want.
you do have to acknowledge that.
They are required to look both at the characteristics of their community and the region. But the problem in part is that the questions that you would ask of a small suburban jurisdiction are very different than the questions that you would ask of a city. And so it's kind of hard to develop a single template that really works everywhere. And now HUD is developing different templates for states and for PHAs, but it is hard. I will say that my view is that the best thing you can do is to work really hard to create some excellent examples.
In the early rounds.
Yes.
Really early to actually invest resources to help communities to create models that other people can follow. I think what we're looking for at the end of the day are models. And if you could say, oh my God, here's a regional plan that actually makes a lot of sense, and it saved us time because instead of having 15 or 20 separate plans, we're just going to do one, right? Then you might actually see that. And this is where I think the idea of what does it mean to support communities is really about education and empowerment, and not just about how do you comply with the minimum standards, but how do you achieve excellence. And actually field office staff can have a role in that too. I mean, I think you know, by the way, I think it's a little unfair to say that no one read the analyses of impediments, because I think a lot of field office staff read them. The question is that I'm not sure they felt empowered to do anything after they read it, to feel like they could then, you know, go and push it back to the Facebook.
I'll admit there is variation, right? But look, I actually think that striving for excellence is a good idea. But I feel like you gotta walk before you can run. And given the compliance perspective, and I think what you were talking about with lawsuits is exactly why we started at the minimum, right? A minimum standard. So we could, so the judge said, what exactly do I need to do? Because they're all gonna ask that question. We can say this, right? And if you do this, you should not get sued, right? You can never guarantee, I mean, you won't get sued by the government. So that's the element. The level of effort that would be required for the agency to come up with a template of excellence, I think, was not feasible.
Let's be very clear. I'm not trying to tell I'm not telling you what they should have done or what they should do. That's not my place. What I'm saying is that you can now, right? Even when you have a requirement of a minimum standard, we could have simultaneously be trying to help people understand what does excellence look like, right? And we could have foundations and other.
I'm sure you're going to do that for us.
Well, somebody needs to do that, right? But I mean, we should be doing that at the same time, because as long as we're going through the effort, let's do a great job, right? Now, just an adequate job.
I agree with that.
But it may be right that other organizations too, outside HUD, should be reviewing these and grading them.
And there are, by the way, there are foundation efforts to invest in a number of communities and providing resources, so hopefully we will get
All
lost.
right, well, I should open up, sorry, I've completely monopolized. So. Yes.
I have a very practical question, which is right now, what is the requirement in terms of jurisdictional size? Or is it, I'm hearing linked to funding? Or who is required to write these? Do they do it at a state and then a local level? Or?
So any jurisdiction that receives grants through CDBG, HOME, HOPWA, and
Direct,
ESG.
not through the state.
Direct.
Not through the state.
No. Any jurisdiction. So the state gets funds that way, so the state has to write one.
Okay.
Entitlement communities get funds that way, so they have to write one. And then counties, for the non-entitlement jurisdictions, they get funds that way, so they have to write one. Right? So in a region, it could be 6 different entities that have to write it, and in some, it could be one. Right? It really depends on how money flows into that community, and then the state covers a lot of other stuff, so they will have to write one as well. And so that's one of the appeals to the regional, right? Then rather than having the 6 different reports that all are going to deal basically with the same data and all be facing the same fundamental issues around segregation and concentrated areas of poverty, you do it once. And everybody gets together and they harmonize their calendars, and then 5 years later they have to do it again. So that's the idea.
I very much enjoyed what you said about wanting to have a real conversation, and I think you're right, we haven't done that. And I want to put you on the spot a little bit, and I apologize, but you're what I have in front of me.
That's why they put the mic on.
So here you are, you worked at HUD many years, and now you're in a, presumably a pretty safe place in academia, and we've invited you to a really reflective space, and you talked about fair housing, and you talked about access to opportunity, reducing disparities, getting to the goals, stopping bad stuff, doing good, mobility, but you never said the word integration. And at least as I understood it, fair housing was always a code word for integration. And back then they were afraid to say it. And I think we're still afraid to say it. And so I guess what I want to put you on the spot about is that the goal? And if so, shouldn't we say it? And if it's not the goal, are we at the risk of going back to a separate but equal approach?
So I don't think that's the exclusive goal. I think integration is a vehicle to have all American citizens have real access opportunity. Right? We are an individualistic society where individuals should be able, given the same amount of resources and the same opportunities, to get to the same place, right? And what we know is that segregation, race-based segregation, has been a barrier to that being a reality, right? And so, when I talked about the two models, right, you could think of a mobility model as an integration model, explicitly. We're gonna take minorities, we're gonna take lower-income people, and we're gonna move them to non-minority, high-income places, right? That is an integration model. I focused on the strategy, on the vehicle, but that's what the outcome would likely to be. The redevelopment model could wind up as integration, right? But it also could wind up as excellent places that, like an ethnic enclave that happens to provide real opportunities for its residents, and they wind up being able to achieve things. And I don't want to preclude the possibility that certain modes of people congregating must be preferred to others if they can get us to the same outcome. I don't know, right? I don't want to get too hung up on that, and so that's why I try to talk about vehicles, right? And because it could be the case that we take a Latino neighborhood, we invest a ton, it becomes a neighborhood of opportunity, and then it becomes integrated, right? That the investment can trigger different development patterns, and so, or movement patterns. And so, I don't know if I answered your question, but I do think that explicitly and exclusively talking about integration is more narrow than I would want it to be.
I want to get the folks from HUD.
Yeah, so I'm gonna start a sentence with my HUD hat on, and then I'm gonna take it off midway. So
Let us know when.
my name is Carlos Torres. My email address is carlos.j.torres, Torres, @HUD.gov. If you work for a PA, or you're a nonprofit, or you're someone who wants to see a certain kind of TA to represent a community that you don't think is going to be communicated well with during this process, I really want you to email me, and then HUD hat is gone, because we really need to build up enough political will within the institution to divert resources towards TA coming out of the enforcement branch. Because the enforcement branch is going to be doing these assessments, and so we need to be out there and participating in the community so that we can build a level of trust with people who are going to be submitting these things to us, who have not had any good reason to trust us in the past. And then the second question, that's actually a question, is, so I'm an attorney, and about half our enforcement staff are attorneys. We have no urban planners. We have no one with good statistics degrees. We have no one who can engage on an academic level that we need to be doing in order to make this process excellent. And I agree that this is kind of pleasantly way. Sorry?
I said we have a lot of students here.
Yeah, and so as much voluntary time as you can give us to provide that internal TA to us would be great. But my question is, what kind of skill building do we need to do as members of that enforcement staff who are going to be going over these AFHs in order to be assessing for strategies that are actually going to address the goals that are being produced as part of that process? Because in the HUD internal training, and please don't go to my bosses with this because I'll get totally done. The level of capacity, and you alluded to this, that is being assumed within the agency as they provide training is very, very low. And the threshold for a strategy to coordinate with a goal is very, very low. And so we're going to have to be able to push back and say, hey, I understand that there is a superficial relationship between these two things, but I need to see a certain kind of strategy that's going to have a certain kind of long-term effect over the 5 or the 7 or the 9 or 10 years in places where you have a regional collaboration that's going to get people on a longer schedule for submission of these to really be effective. So what do I need to be, what do I need to know, what do I need to be developing in myself so that I can go out and both provide effective TA, but then also do my evaluations of these assessments quickly and well, because that 60-day window, when 2019 hits and we have 5 staff with 63 submissions, we're going to have to know we're doing well in advance of that. We can't come into that and like, hey, now I'm going to get my urban planning degree and that's all it's saying.
So I would say three things now that Jeff talked. First, that's real insight, what you just said, because there's a practicality about this that I think the agency, we all have to grapple with. The second thing I would say is the Congress has set up a structure whereby HUD is not allowed to use money to train its own staff, right? So that leads to the third thing, which is if you want to get training, find a way to get into the training with the jurisdictions and get trained with them and through them so that you're at least as well versed in the issues as the folks you're going to be working with. So those would be my first three comments.
It's a real issue, and Raphael has some good ideas. I want to throw out a few others. So, first of all, I think there are a lot of stakeholders nationwide who care about this and are paying attention. And I would say, particularly philanthropic foundations, we should be talking with them about to what extent could they help provide training, for example, that wouldn't cost the federal government anything, that would help, train in this. Because it seems to me that part of what you need to understand is how do you really make sense of the data in a way that leads one to sort of suggest certain types of solutions, right, rather than others. And then the other thing is, what are the best practices about how to do this really, really well, right? And those aren't things that lawyers are typically trained in, right? I mean, you're trained in sort of what's the minimum required by the law, what is 24 CFR Part 986 sub 3, do whatever, And typically, to be honest, HUD TA is all about what 24 CFR Part 986, it's also the same thing, right? Because there's this idea that we're training to a minimum standard rather than we're training for excellence, right? So, and I would say this, that the trainings that we're doing around the country are really about how do you do this and put together an acceptable one. It's still not far enough. Partly because we only have a day and a half or 2 days or whatever, it takes time. So you've got time, you're looking ahead to 2019. Let your field, let FHEO know that you've got these issues, that you want the training, and let's figure out how we can get it to you without violating whatever rules. I mean, there's a lot of, it could be, for example, that the TA providers develop a new training that's around, not just around how do you comply with the rule, but how do we actually what are the strategies that maybe are most effective, and how do we use data creatively to sort of support those strategies? We can put that training on for everybody, including for the staff, right? So now there's more literacy. And the final thing I would just say is, when you're doing the responses, it's really important, not just to say this passes or not, but what could people do better, right? I think people, if they could get good positive feedback, even if it doesn't mean it's failing, it could say, well, maybe you passed the minimum standard, but have you thought about this or that? And it sure looks like in your jurisdiction, there are places you could be using vouchers that have more opportunity than places where folks are using their vouchers now. Have you thought about sort of promoting mobility or whatever, right? And there are ways that we can help you use data to come to those conclusions, but all of those things go beyond the kind of the minimum that's included as part of the current standard.
Do I get one or do I get one?
One last question.
One quick question. So,
This is
so quick question, quick answer.
this is an area of concern for the fair housing advocacy community, and of course in almost all jurisdictions there is none, or for each housing authority there is none. And it's about the consequences of what Raphael described of HUD sort of somewhat abdicating on its enforcement role or drawing back on its enforcement role in favor of encouragement, which is what to do when, no matter how much evidence is presented, a community sets goals that are obviously not the most important. So just take any extreme example. You have a housing authority, every single voucher is being used in very difficult neighborhoods, none elsewhere. They've always known this, but now with data they know it more. And somebody says, you should do something about this, but instead they pick other goals, perhaps something to do with that may be important, but less important, seemingly. Something to do with disability or some other goal. And the Section 8 program continues to be highly segregated. there's a concern that the way
so-
this thing is erected, that could happen and what's to do.
Let me speak to that.
One minute.
The challenge is, how do you determine most? What's most important? And that's why we want this to be a conversation. So my expectation is if we were talking about the situation we raised, there would be documentation that in 8 public meetings, the community said that issue X was the most important, and that issue Y was the 7th most important. If the city came back and said issue Y is the most important, that raises a red flag, right? And that allows us to have a questioning conversation before we get to the, we gotta do this all over, right? And so I think that the process is actually quite important, and making sure that all the voices are present and heard is a critical element of this. And the last thing I would say is I don't think that HUD is abrogating its compliance requirement. There will be enforcement if the minimum is not met. And much of our debate was how do you set up a structure such that we can scrutinize the actual decision-making that takes place in communities and in through this process. Because what I would say is we heard a lot of that concern in our discussions, and other parts of the building would say, well, you think that's the most, but just because you think that's the most doesn't mean that everybody does. And we want to make sure that everyone weighs in. And so there may be disagreements at the end of the day about what the most is, but we want to have some documented evidence that somebody thought whatever was claimed was the most, because that would demonstrate some degree of community deliberation, and to me that's where we want to get to, like real deliberation.
So we clearly could talk about this for quite a bit longer, and I'm sorry I didn't get everybody's questions, but please join me in thanking Raphael and Jeff for being here. Next week, Tuesday, we have our 3rd session, which is Ed Getz.
Ed Getz and David Harris.
And David Harris.
They're also, another problem with the projects, we have all these suburban